Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Imagine for a second that you are a wealthy Roman patrician.
Right, living in the first century.
Yeah, living right in the middle of the first century. You own these massive estates. You wield, significant political leverage in the city.
You're at the very top of the food chain.
Absolutely. The surrounding culture tells you constantly that you are, well, practically a god compared to the foreign slaves sweeping your marble floors. I mean, society is built brick by brick on the idea that human value is measured by bloodline, by wealth, and by cultural refinement.
It was an incredibly rigid hierarchy.
It was. So now, imagine a letter arrives in your city from a man you've never met. You sit down in a crowded room to hear it read aloud, and his opening argument basically boils down to this. You and the enslaved foreigner standing by the door are on the identical footing. And both of you are on cosmic death row.
Which is just a staggering thing to hear in that culture.
It really is. So, today, for you listening, we're doing a massive verse-by-verse analysis, a deep dive into Frank Thielman's commentary on the first chapter of Romans. Our mission for this deep dive is to understand the radical nature of Paul's message in its original Greco-Roman context.
Yeah, we're going to unpack how this letter just shatters those ancient social hierarchies.
Right. And we'll break down the precise legal mechanisms of God's justice and wrath.
It's a stunning document. I mean, when you read a letter written to a relatively small first-century church community, you really don't expect it to completely upend modern assumptions about fairness and, human autonomy.
You think of it as just a historical greeting.
Yeah, but it's not some quaint greeting. It is a highly calculated legal argument that dismantles the way humanity organizes itself. Paul is walking into the intellectual capital of the world and laying down a challenge that flips the entire Roman justice system on its head.
Let's set the stage here, though, because if Paul is going to completely level the social hierarchy, putting the elite Roman and the enslaved foreigner on the same playing field, he has a massive logical problem.
Right. A huge one.
He is writing to Christians in Rome, which is a church he didn't plant. It's full of people who don't know him. Before he can present these radical arguments, he has to establish his right to speak to that room in the first place.
And we see this in his elaborate opening credentials. His theology is completely inseparable from his identity as a messenger, bridging the Old Testament and the non-Jewish world.
Right. The letter format itself is unusual.
Yeah, so the structure of ancient Greek letters was typically really brief, very to the point. You'd have the sender's name, the recipient's name, and a quick greeting.
Like, hey, from me to you.
Spot on. You might write something like Apollotios to Thunis, greetings. It was purely utilitarian. But Paul completely blows up that standard format. He uses the longest letter opening of any of his writings. It takes 7 dense verses just to introduce himself.
Wow, 7 verses just to say hello.
Yeah, and he identifies himself with 3 specific titles right out of the gate. He calls himself a slave of Christ Jesus, a called apostle, and one set apart.
Okay, let's stop right there at the first title, slave. In the Greco-Roman world, identifying yourself as a slave was not a networking strategy. I mean, it was a position of total degradation. Why would he lead with that?
To a Roman citizen, it would sound absurd, just completely backwards. But Paul is operating from a highly specific Jewish context here. When he calls himself a slave of Christ Jesus, he is intentionally aligning himself with massive historical figures.
Like Moses.
Yeah, Moses, Joshua, the prophets. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, those leaders were frequently called slaves of the Lord. So Paul is claiming immediate prophetic authority.
Oh, I see. So he's not saying, I'm a victim of society.
Not at all. He is saying he is the authorized envoy of the Supreme King. And then he says he is set apart for the gospel that comes from God. And the Greek word there is euangelion.
I want to pause on that word, euangelion, because this is where the cultural collision really happens. That term was not originally a religious, church-going word, was it?
No, not at all in the Roman context. In the Greco-Roman world, euangelion was a political term. It meant a joyful, world-altering announcement.
Tied to the emperor, right?
Usually, yes.
Yeah.
Tied to a military victory or the emperor himself. To give you a clear historical visual, there is a famous stone inscription from 9 BC. It was found in Priene, which is a city in Asia Minor.
What does the inscription say?
It celebrates the birthday of the Emperor Augustus. The text literally refers to his birth as the beginning of good news, the euangelium for the world. It was seen as bringing global peace and prosperity. The Roman emperor was viewed as a divine figure bringing a new era of stability.
So when Paul uses that specific word to describe his message, he's intentionally hijacking Roman imperial propaganda.
Precisely. Paul's making a subversive claim. He's saying the true joyful news of worldwide significance is not about Caesar sitting on a throne in Rome.
That's bold.
It is. But he's also drawing heavily on the Jewish biblical use of the term. If you read the book of Isaiah, the word refers to the joyful tidings of God arriving to rescue Israel from exile and disaster. So Paul is blending this ancient Jewish hope with a direct challenge to the Roman state.
And the content of this joyful news is centered entirely on a person. Paul gives this fascinating dual description of Christ. First, he describes Jesus from a neutral, sort of human angle, saying he is born from David's offspring according to the flesh.
Right.
But then Paul shifts gears. He describes Jesus according to the Spirit of holiness, marked out as the Son of God in sovereign strength by his resurrection from the dead.
Paul is laying down a massive theological claim here. He is arguing that the ancient Hebrew scriptures are completely incomplete without this specific message about Jesus. Jesus fulfills the ancient promises made to King David regarding a royal bloodline.
The human side.
Yeah. But his resurrection triggers a completely new age. The resurrection is the moment Jesus begins to function as the Son of God in sovereign strength. He is the first to enter into a new, immortal physical existence, which signals the end of the old era of sin and death.
I'm curious how this specific opening countered the historical divisions that popped up later in the church, because people constantly tried to pull these two things apart, the Jewish history and the new message of Christ.
It is brilliant how Paul's introduction refutes those historical errors before they even fully developed. Take Marcion in the 2nd century, for instance.
Oh, right. He wanted to get rid of the Old Testament.
Yeah, Marcion looked at the Old Testament and decided it was too harsh. So he tried to discard it entirely, trying to separate the Christian God of grace from the creator God of the Jews. But Paul's opening shuts that down instantly by rooting the message firmly in the writing prophets and the Davidic line.
You just can't have Paul's message without the Hebrew scriptures.
You can't. And on the flip side, you had groups trying to make it exclusively Jewish.
Like the Ebionites.
Right. You had groups like the Ebionites, who tried to reduce Christianity to a localized Jewish sect. They viewed Jesus as a great human teacher, a moral example, but nothing more.
So they denied the divine aspect.
Yeah. And Paul shuts that down by highlighting Christ's divine designation and sovereign strength through the resurrection. Both errors fail when you read these opening 7 verses. The message is deeply rooted in history, but it breaks the boundaries of human limitation.
I mean, think of this opening as a highly calibrated, heavily footnoted resume. Paul is applying for the job, a theological guide to a church he didn't start. How does he balance his heavy-handed apostolic authority with the fact that these Roman Christians already have their own established community?
He does it with incredible diplomacy. He calls them dearly loved by God and says they are called to be holy. He takes the standard Greek greeting of health or joy and replaces it with grace and peace, blending Greek and Hebrew blessings.
That's a nice touch.
It is. He establishes his supreme authority, yes, but he speaks to them as members of the same divine family.
So Paul's resume establishes his right to speak. But why Rome? If his goal is to talk about a Jewish Messiah, why is he so desperate to reach the capital of the pagan world?
That's the big question.
And the answer lies in the unique demographics of the city and Paul's specific mission to disrupt social barriers. After the intro, the letter shifts to his audience. The reason Paul is so determined to reach Rome is that his specific message is designed to obliterate the very caste systems Rome used to maintain public order.
Yeah, Paul gives thanks to God because the faith of the Roman Christians is known worldwide. He tells them he prays constantly, asking God to finally allow him to visit them. He says he wants to impart a spiritual gift to them so they might be strengthened.
But then, almost immediately, he corrects his own language so he doesn't sound arrogant.
He does. He uses a very specific verb there. He says he wants to share. The Greek word is metadou rather than give.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, he diplomatically avoids sounding like he is swooping in from above to fix them. He clarifies that he wants to be encouraged together with them through their mutual faith. It is a stunning display of leveling the ground between an apostle and a local congregation. He places himself alongside them.
And then he takes that leveling concept and applies it to the entire Roman world, which is where things get really tense. He states that he is a debtor to Greeks and barbarians, to the sophisticated and the foolish.
That would have hit a nerve.
We need to stop right there. What did the word barbarian actually mean to a first-century Roman?
It was not just a geographical label for someone living outside the borders. It was a viciously degrading slur. The entire Roman society was built on strict vertical hierarchies. At the top, you had the educated, noble-born Greeks and Romans.
The elites.
Right. They possessed the wealth, the culture, the philosophical training. At the absolute bottom of the ladder were the barbarians. The word itself originated because the Greeks thought foreign languages sounded like stammering, just bar, bar, bar.
So it was a mockery of their speech.
Yeah, which bled into a mockery of their humanity. They were viewed as innately inferior. To give you context on how deep this prejudice ran, the philosopher Aristotle explicitly taught that barbarians were naturally deficient in intelligence.
Aristotle said that.
He did. He argued that a barbarian and a slave were essentially the same by nature, that they were born to be subjugated by the Greeks. The elite viewed them as living tools entirely devoid of reason, suitable only for physical labor.
Wow. So try to picture the physical setup of a Roman household church at this time. You'd have the wealthy master of the house, a Roman citizen, hosting the gathering. And sitting in the same room, hearing this letter read aloud, would be his slaves, the very people society labeled as barbarians.
Sitting right next to each other.
If a highly educated leader today said they owe the identical intellectual and moral debt to a celebrated academic and someone utterly marginalized by society, it would turn heads. How shocking was it for Paul to claim that this new message levels the playing field so completely?
It was wildly offensive. For a Roman citizen with philosophical training, the idea that a religious teacher owed the identical obligation to an elite patrician and an uneducated foreign slave was absurd.
Because Roman society glorified those social boundaries.
Absolutely. The power structure depended on making sure the sophisticated and the foolish never occupied the same social standing. Yet Paul says his divine commission obligates him to all of them equally, because all of them stand before the Creator on equal terms.
Well, if Paul is completely leveling the social hierarchy, putting the emperor and the enslaved foreigner on the identical footing, he has a massive logical problem. By what legal standard can they possibly be treated the same? The Romans measured worth by bloodline and wealth. Paul has to introduce a completely alien justice system.
Right, because if salvation is based on belief rather than pedigree, all human hierarchies collapse.
And Paul writes that he is not ashamed of this message.
Which is a bold statement on its own, considering that a cross-centered religion would seem utterly shameful to a status-obsessed Roman culture. Crucifixion was a punishment reserved specifically for slaves, pirates, and rebels.
It was designed to be humiliating.
Completely. It was designed to strip a person of all honor and display them as garbage. To say that your ultimate allegiance is to a crucified man was to invite intense social ridicule from the elite.
Yet Paul says this message brings saving might to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And then we hit the central phrase, the engine driving the entire letter. The righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith.
And he backs this up with a quotation from the ancient prophet Habakkuk. The one who is righteous by faith will live.
I'm hung up on the word righteous. Usually if I call someone a righteous person today, I mean, they do good things, they pay their taxes, they help their neighbors, they don't lie.
Are you saying Paul is using this word completely differently? Yes, we have to strip away our modern moralistic definition. The Greek word Paul uses is dikaiosine. For the average person living in the Roman Empire, this word meant strict fairness and equity in a courtroom setting.
So it's a legal term.
Very much so. To give you a mental image, the Emperor Nero minted coins in Alexandria around the same time Paul was writing this letter. On those coins was the image of the goddess Equitas Equity. She stood upright, holding a perfectly balanced set of scales. The label stamped on that coin was dikaiosine.
So when the Roman Christians heard the righteousness of God, their first thought would be a judge holding balanced scales, administering perfect, impartial, unbending justice.
Spot on, but Paul's also drawing heavily on his Jewish background. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures righteousness often referred to God taking up the cause of the oppressed.
So it was an active thing.
Yeah, an active rescuing concept. It meant God stepping in to vindicate his people against their enemies. So Paul is combining these ideas. God is perfectly fair and impartial, treating the Greek and the barbarian the identical way with his balanced scales, but God is also actively moving to rescue people.
Wait, If a human judge acquits a clearly guilty criminal, we call that a corrupt judge. That is the opposite of balanced scales.
It sounds like it, yeah.
Paul says God declares guilty people to be in the right based on faith. How does Paul resolve the tension of God maintaining his strict fairness while clearing the guilty?
This is the genius of Paul's argument. He resolves this tension by explaining the substitutionary atoning death of Christ. God does not simply ignore the crimes or pretend the guilty are innocent.
The penalty still has to be paid.
Right. The penalty for the rebellion must be paid to maintain the balanced scales of justice. Christ steps in as the substitute. The theological concept here is propitiation, which is tied to the ancient mercy seat.
You use the term propitiation and mercy seat. That sounds like heavy theological jargon. Break that down for me. What does that actually look like visually?
To understand it, you have to, mentally step inside the ancient Jewish temple on the Day of Atonement.
Okay, setting the scene.
Inside the most holy room sat the Ark of the Covenant, a golden box. Inside that box were the stone tablets of the law, the strict, unbending rules that the people had broken. The law demanded justice. Above the box was the presence of God.
So God is looking down at the broken law.
Exactly. Precisely. If the holy God looks directly down at the broken law, the result is wrath and judgment for the people. But on top of that box was a golden lid called the mercy seat.
And the high priest would take the blood of a sacrificed animal and sprinkle it on that golden lid.
Yes. The blood acted as a buffer. When God looked down at the broken law, he saw the blood of the substitute first. The penalty had been paid. The demands of strict justice were entirely satisfied by the sacrifice, allowing God to remain entirely fair while releasing the guilty from punishment.
So the judge isn't corrupt.
Right. Paul is saying Jesus is the ultimate mercy seat. Christ's sacrificial death absorbs the penalty. The guilties are acquitted because the Son of God took the sentence.
So justification is a past tense judicial decision. It's an acquittal in God's courtroom. It's not an ongoing process of trying to act better so the judge will eventually let you go.
No, the verdict has already been handed down.
The Greek patrician and the barbarian slave both walk into the courtroom with massive rap sheets. Neither has an advantage, and both are offered the very same substitute.
And because this acquittal is received strictly through faith, not through cultural achievement or noble birth, the ground at the foot of the cross is perfectly level. God doesn't wait for a person to improve their behavior and then declare them righteous. He declares them righteous based entirely on faith as a free gift.
And then the behavior changes as a result of that new status.
Absolutely.
Well, to grasp the magnitude of this acquittal, you have to understand the severity of the charges. Why is humanity on trial in the first place? And why is God's fierce reaction considered fair? We move from the revelation of God's saving grace to the revelation of his wrath, because his wrath is the proof of his strict fairness.
Yeah, without the fairness of the wrath, the grace has no legal backdrop. Just doesn't make sense.
Paul writes that God's wrath is currently being revealed from heaven against all impiety and unrighteousness of human beings who intentionally stifle the truth. Notice the present tense there. This is not just a future event at the end of the world. It's happening right now in daily life.
And Paul insists that God is entirely fair in doing this because humanity has no excuse.
Paul relies on the concept of general revelation here. He says the invisible attributes of the Creator, specifically his eternal sovereign strength and divine nature, are clearly perceived through the things that have been made.
It's all around us.
Anyone can look at the physical universe, from the complex orbit of the stars down to the sheer strength of the oceans, and conclude that a brilliant, intensely strong Creator made it.
And because of that clear, undeniable evidence, the core offense of humanity is laid bare. Paul says that although they knew God, they refused to glorify or thank him as God. They received the gifts of creation, but refused to honor the giver.
They wanted the benefits without the authority.
Right. And what's fascinating here is how Paul tracks the downward cognitive spiral that results from that single refusal.
Imagine a company stealing a revolutionary patent, but adamantly refusing to acknowledge the original inventor. Over time, because they deny the creator's original blueprints, they forget how the machine actually works and end up breaking it.
That's a great analogy.
They stifle the truth, and the machine of human reasoning breaks down. They're holding the broken gears, claiming to be brilliant engineers, while the whole factory burns down around them.
That is a highly accurate picture of what Paul is describing. The cognitive faculties of humanity are shattered because they severed themselves from the reality of the Creator. Because they refused to acknowledge God, their reasoning processes were rendered futile and their foolish hearts were darkened.
I thought they were so smart.
While claiming to be wise, they became babbling fools. They rejected the source of all reason, so their own capacity to reason broke down.
Paul uses a brilliant illustration of this breakdown, the idolatrous exchange. Humanity traded the glory of the incorruptible God for images of corruptible humans, then birds, then quadrupeds, then reptiles.
It's a complete de-evolution.
Notice how the list descends from the sky down to the dirt. It mimics humanity's moral descent. You start by worshiping a human form, then you move to the birds in the air, then the animals on the ground, and finally, you're bowing down to a snake in the dirt.
It's a deliberate theological de-evolution. In the Genesis creation account, humanity is positioned as the pinnacle of creation, made in God's image, tasked with ruling over the birds, the animals, and the creeping things.
So they flick the order.
Yeah, by worshiping those things, humanity voluntarily gives up its crown and subjects itself to the very things it was supposed to govern. They exchange the truth for a lie, choosing to revere the creature rather than the creator.
Think about how we do this today. We don't necessarily bow down to wooden statues of birds or bronze reptiles. But how often do we take a good thing, like a career, financial security, or a political movement, and elevate it to the ultimate thing?
We do it constantly.
We demand that our created circumstances provide the peace and security that only the Creator can offer.
And when you make a created thing your ultimate source of meaning, it will eventually crush you because it was never designed to bear that weight.
So the machine is broken, but how does the inventor respond? The punishment must fit the crime perfectly to maintain the judge's equity with those balanced scales. Because humanity exchanged the truth for a lie, God responds with an exchange of his own.
It's terrifying, really.
We look at the specific penalties God enacts, proving that his judgments are not arbitrary lightning bolts from the sky, but are the natural outcome of human demands.
3 distinct times in this text, a solemn phrase tolls like a bell. God handed them over. It is judicial language. God acts as the judge, issuing a sentence that perfectly mirrors the offense.
What's the first one?
First, Paul says God handed them over in the lusts of their hearts to uncleanness and the dishonoring of their bodies. Because they dishonored God, God allowed them to dishonor themselves.
And second, God handed them over to dishonorable passions. The text points specifically to females and males exchanging natural sexual functions for unnatural ones.
Right. And third, God handed them over to a worthless mind. What is fascinating here is the brilliant wordplay in the original Greek. Because humanity tested God and deemed him not worthwhile, the Greek word is idokimason, God handed them over to a worthless idokimon mind.
Oh, wow. Edokimason and adokimon.
You can hear the repetition in the words. They found God unqualified for their worship, so God gave them minds completely unqualified to make moral decisions.
Wait, isn't that entrapment? If God breaks their ability to reason, handing them over to a worthless mind, how is it fair to then punish them for making bad, irrational choices?
It's not entrapment, because God is not forcing them against their will. He is simply removing the restraints. It's a terrifying reality of God saying, "Your will be done."
Giving them what they want.
Yes, humanity demanded autonomy. They demanded to operate without the Creator's rules. So God steps back and gives them precisely what their rebellious hearts crave. The worthless mind is the natural consequence of disconnecting from the source of all truth.
That makes sense.
The sexual exchanges Paul describes are portrayed as a physical parallel to the spiritual exchange of idolatry. Humanity traded the natural design of creation for a parody of it, just as they traded the true Creator for fake idols.
So the penalty corresponds directly to the crime. God steps back, and the result is total societal collapse. Paul illustrates this resulting chaos with a terrifying rapid-fire list of 21 social ills.
It's a brutal list.
He lists things like murder, which makes sense. But then he lists gossip, disobeying parents. Why do those things belong in the same list as murder?
Because they all stem from the very same root of rejecting the Creator's authority. When you sever society from a transcendent truth, all relationships become transactional and predatory.
So everything breaks down.
Everything. Why does rejecting God lead to disobeying parents? Because if there is no ultimate Creator to honor, the concept of honoring earthly authority completely dissolves. Why does it lead to gossip and slander? Because if human beings are not made in the image of a holy God, they have no inherent dignity, so you can destroy their reputation for your own social gain. The breakdown of trust and the tearing of the social fabric are the inevitable results of philosophical rebellion.
I read that in the original Greek, the alliteration and rhyming in this list are intense.
They are. For instance, the words for envy and murder are thono and phonu. They sound almost identical. The words tumble over each other chaotically in the sentence structure.
So Paul is basically dropping a first-century rap verse to highlight how chaotic society has become.
That is a great way to put it. The rhythmic chaos of the language perfectly mimics a culture that has lost all rational grounding. It moves from general evils like greed and malice to specific harms like murder and treachery, and then focuses on specific types of people: gossips, slanderers, bullies.
Paul claims in verse 32 that these people know full well the righteous decree of God, that these actions deserve death, yet they applaud others who do them. Does every person really inherently know this, or is Paul making a massive rhetorical assumption to trap his audience?
He's tapping into a universal acknowledgement in antiquity. Across various ancient cultures, whether Roman, Greek, or barbarian, the idea that cosmic offenses brought severe penalties was widely accepted. People intrinsically knew that rampant murder, treachery, and malice tore apart the fabric of reality and invited divine retribution. But Paul is definitely setting a rhetorical trap here.
How so?
Well, by detailing these extreme, mostly Gentile vices, he gets the self-righteous moralist, perhaps an unbelieving Jewish reader or sophisticated Greek philosopher, to nod along in agreement.
Oh, I see.
The moralist sits there listening to the letter, nodding and thinking, yes, those pagans are terrible and deserve judgment. By securing that agreement, Paul establishes the total depravity of humanity. He sets the stage perfectly for chapter 2, where he will spin around, point his finger at the listener, and prove that the moralist sitting in the judge's seat is equally guilty of rebellion, just in a more refined way.
Man, that's brilliant. So what does this all mean for us today? Let's review the massive arc of this discussion. We started with a credentialed messenger, Paul, acting as an authorized envoy, bringing a message designed to completely destroy social hierarchies.
He told the elites of Rome that he owed the identical debt to them as he did to the uneducated, marginalized barbarians.
We looked at the shocking legal mechanism of a strict judge maintaining absolute fairness while acquitting the guilty, entirely through the substitutionary sacrifice of Christ acting as the mercy seat.
And we saw the absolute equity of God's wrath. It is not an arbitrary loss of temper. It's a perfectly tailored judicial response to humanity's cosmic rebellion.
They demanded autonomy.
Right. Humanity demanded autonomy from the Creator, descending into irrationality and idolatry. And God responded by handing them over to the logical conclusions of their own twisted desires.
So, I ask you to reconsider how you view justice. Do you evaluate fairness through the lens of social status, weighing people's worth by their education, their wealth, or their cultural refinement? Or do you see humanity through the strict, level playing field established by the Creator, where every single person is guilty and every single person is offered the very same rescue?
It changes everything.
It really does. We often think of divine judgment as fire raining down from the sky. But based on this text, what if the most terrifying judgment a society can face isn't a sudden disaster, but God simply stepping back and giving that society what it demands? If God's wrath is handing us over to our own unrestrained desires, how should that alter the way we evaluate what cultural freedom actually looks like?